Great. So I'm so pleased that I get to introduce our keynote presentation. This is very exciting for me to have Michael here, and always exciting for me when Oren says yes to things that I ask him to do. Um, oh, okay. Do you need your computer in that? Okay, great. So, this session is this conversation with Michael Lerner and Oren Slozberg is called Does Spirit Truly Move Among Us? Reflections on Panpsychism and the Nature of Consciousness. So I want to introduce Michael. Michael Lerner is the co-founder of Commonweal in Bolinas. He has, which you founded 49 and a half years ago, Michael. Michael has worked extensively in environmental health and justice, was a pioneer in integrative cancer care, and is a leader in the polycrisis awareness movement. His current work is centered on personal and planetary resilience. He is a MacArthur Fellow and the author of Choices in Healing. Oren Slozberg, who's right here next to me, is the executive director of Commonweal in Bolinas, which is an organization focused with 30 some odd programs focused on healing, justice, and resilience. Oren's work at Commonweal is currently focusing on fostering the expansion of Commonweal's capacity and diversity, meeting emerging needs, cultivating new kinds of programs, addressing the changing world and the poly crisis. Oren has been a senior program developer in the fields of education, youth development, and the arts. He's also, as I'm sure you all know, my husband. I'm going to step out of the way now and leave this to the two of you, but I might be asking some questions from the background.
Please do. Oh, you're leaving completely.
I'm just getting out of the
Okay.
frame.
It is great to be here with Michael, who's a dear friend and guide, I should say, that we met 12 years ago. It's hard to believe that it's been that long. And it's great to be in Ner Shalom, which this is not a new experience for me. I've been here before, and it's always wonderful to come back to this community, especially when two worlds intersect. And when Erwin was mentioning about thinking about those mysteries, that unknown knowledge, it kind of took me back to school. I think everybody knows. Well, I grew up in Israel, and we studied the Bible every day from second grade through high school. The lens that we used was mostly secular because it wasn't a religious school, which means that we looked at the stories in the Bible, the events in the Bible, the miracles in the Bible. They were all metaphors for something. And there was in some cases, there was a pseudo-scientific explanation. The parting of the Red Sea was the low tide in the area around the Suez Canal, or the revelation in Sinai was a distant volcanic eruption. None of those were too convincing. And kind of there was a non-explicit message that these are just fabrications to make a religious point. And we grew up with this kind of mindset that that the Bible was just stories. That it was just an amalgamation of fiction. And kind of being indoctrinated in the ways of the world, I kind of held on to this idea is that things had to be proven, that we can explain everything through the scientific worldview or the materialist worldview. And we taught that to our kids. When our son Ari was studying for the bar mitzvah with Geshe, Geshe asked him at some point, what do you think about God? And Ari paused. And then the 13-year-old said, God died the moment before the Big Bang. So the moment before the Big Bang is when God died. Because his unspoken assumption is that science, that physics and biology and astronomy will be able to explain everything else since then. What happened before, he was willing to kind of allocate to the mystery to God. But from that moment on, which is impressive for a 13-year-old, for him it was not a question whether we will ever be able to understand everything. To him, it's just a question of when. To him, science will be able to explain this. That worldview, that's what's called materialism, has grown gradually, I would say, since the Enlightenment, but probably before that. And it's become almost dogmatic to the point that, and I still struggle with this, is that if science can't explain it, it doesn't exist. If that we can't do a scientific study, that means it's not real. There was a story of a Hungarian physician who practiced at a labor and delivery center in Vienna, and he had this idea that when physicians would go from mother to mother, they were transferring some invisible poison. So he instituted at the hospital, he was at two hospitals. One was for a wealthy clientele and one was for poor women. At the poor women's hospital, he was the doctor in charge, and he instituted a policy of washing hands. And people made fun of him. It's like, what do you mean washing hands? It's like, what are you doing? And he said, well, there's a poison in there. It's like, but you can't see it. It's not real. The death rate among women in the poorhouse dropped dramatically. At the wealthy hospital, they wouldn't listen to him. And for while he was there, and while he was at the hospital where he instituted hand washing, the death rate among women who were giving birth stayed low. And people made fun of him. It's like, oh, you can't prove it. You can't see it, so there's nothing there. The fact that you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. Just because we don't see it, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So it was about 12 years ago I started working at Commonweal. Michael invited me to work with him. He had an intuition, which was informed by many walks along the cliffs over the Pacific at the southern tip of Point Reyes, that there was a good fit. And the fact that Commonweal is physically on the edge is kind of symbolic, because the work that Commonweal has done has been at the edge. And I think a lot of it was born out of healing. And healing is also one of those things that you can't see it, you can't measure it, but you know it when you feel it, that it exists. I mean, how do you explain that 8 people sitting in a circle has a healing property to it? It's not necessarily the kind of thing that can be quantified. There's a lot of unknowing. The Dalai Lama talks about sitting at the table of the unknowing. And there's a lot of people at that table. There's thousands of stories, and I'm sure almost everybody here, if we asked, had that experience of thinking about someone you haven't thought about in a long time, and then they call. Or making a decision that was not rational, but later on came across as the right decision. Or hearing from someone who has passed, right? These things happen. There are thousands and thousands of stories like that. And I'm willing to sit at that table of the unknowing where I just don't know, that I just can't understand. People talk about going into deep meditation and learning something new, a psychedelic trip where kind of information is downloaded. To me, that is sitting at the table of the unknown. My rational brain says, oh, it's a coincidence. We think about people all the time. It just happened that person called at that moment when you thought about them. Or this information that came out of nowhere, you probably overheard it and it got engraved in your brain. So there's all these kind of clumsy scientific solutions, which kind of reminds me of like how we explain the miracles in the Bible. Like, oh, there happened to be a low tide in the Red Sea at the exact moment the people of Israel were crossing. It was a similar kind of ambivalence about whether this is an attempt just to fit things into the materialist world. It's not only us that have stories. If you look at spiritual texts, religious texts, it's full of myths that are harder for us to take. As religion, I think, has focused more on tradition and belief and became less experiential, we have distanced ourselves from what might have been a true experience, might have been a real experience, right? We moved into this materialist world, so the miracles have become metaphors, and we don't think about them as embodied experiences, which brings us to what we're going to talk about today. And a lot of this is inspired by Jeffrey Kripal, that Michael knows, and we'll talk a lot more about. But he wrote this book called The Flip, which is my book of the year that I'm recommending to everybody, which is where it's stories of scientists and philosophers and thought leaders that had an experience that made them realize that the materialistic worldview has another side to it, and that's their awareness of consciousness. And people like Mark Twain and Madame Curie and Albert Einstein all realized that, this materialistic world that everything can be explained in a material way has another side that we can't explain. And that moment when you realize that, that is the flip. I personally have not had a flip moment per se, like that exact moment when it happened, but I've had enough experience that I have a reserved seat at that table of the unknowing. And I am finding that that is a place that has deeper understandings, including the circumstances of where we are right now. And I think, Michael, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Aaron. And may I ask we just all go quiet together for a moment, just in, I know Erwin already did this, but just in prayer for this evening's study together, and asking the power of spirit and the power of the divine to open our minds and hearts to the deepest teachings that we can find tonight together. So let's just go quiet for a moment. Peace. Thank you for that. At Commonweal, we open almost every conversation that many of us have together with a moment of silence, and then asking some question that brings us all into the room. And so the question we agreed on tonight is the question, does spirit truly move among us? And that question clearly questions what Oren was just describing as the secular rational mindset, which Jeffrey Kripal takes on so beautifully in The Flip and his 12 other books. I won't try to describe all of Kripal's work. He's written 13 books, and I'm doing a series of 14 conversations with him at the New School at Commonweal. I've recorded 2 so far. But for me, he is among the primary synthesizing minds of a view of the nature of reality that is fundamentally challenging the materialist paradigm that has swept through the Western world and much of the rest of the world over the last century, which discarded a much more ancient teaching, both Jewish and in virtually most traditions, that consciousness is not simply what the materialists believe, which is an entirely random survival mechanism of the evolution of the human brain, that consciousness just randomly turned out to be useful to our survival. By contrast, if you look back at original peoples, if you look back at Western and Eastern traditions, the teaching has, for the most part, been that consciousness is either ubiquitous in the universe or even that it's primary. So the distinction is that those who believe it is primary believe that consciousness comes first and everything else is a vibrational step down of consciousness. You could call that the Neoplatonic view. Plotinus and others, Oren referenced Kripal's book, The Flip, believed that the brain is not only a transmitter, but a receiver, and therefore that consciousness comes down into us as well as going out from us. And that teaching, if we want to simply follow the Western tradition, you can date it from Plato and some of the pre-Socratics through Plotinus up through Leibniz and Huxley, whose great book on the perennial philosophy he published just at the end of World War II. In many of the spiritual traditions that say truth is one, paths are many, its benefit and the way Kripal teaches it, so he does not teach that consciousness is primary. He teaches a variant of whatever we want to call panpsychism. And by the way, the Wikipedia entry on panpsychism describes it as a meta theory with at least a dozen different variants. And he describes it as what he calls, in technical term, a dual aspect monism, meaning that consciousness and the material world are both primary, but they grow out of a common substrate. And the way our brains are organized cognitively, we have to separate them in order to understand them. We have to see a material world and a consciousness world, but in fact, they are one. It's just that our cognitive apparatus can't perceive that, and so we separate them. I'm sorry that's a little technical, but I'll just stop there for a minute. Stepping way back, I just want to express to Erwin my deep gratitude for allowing me to be an errant member of your community. And really, as you know, you're the first rabbi I've ever had. I wasn't looking for a rabbi. But in fact, my father was
popular. I'm very popular among people with no basis of comparison.
Well, I have a basis because your two predecessors, the first was in Israel. Did you know Rabbi Levi Wyman Kelman Irwin?
His grandfather married my parents.
Okay. Well, as you know, he comes from quite a lineage. And I went over for the first time to Israel with my brother. My father, Max Lerner, was a secular political philosopher, but my mother was Christian. So, you know, the Jews have always seen me as Christian. The Christians have always seen me as Jewish. And I grew up in a secular household with no special focus on Israel, except that my father regarded the American imperium and Israel as his two basic frames of reference. And I always said that if I knew in any situation what was good for the American imperium, what was good for Israel, I could predict his position. So I grew up that way, not thinking a lot about Israel. But then along comes the 6-Day War. And my brother, Steve Lerner, and I both flew over to Israel with foreign correspondent credentials, his for the Village Voice and mine for the Atlantic Monthly and the Washington Post. And both of us knew that we were putting our lives in danger, and we did it very consciously. We were both quite prepared to die if needed, though it certainly wasn't something we were looking forward to. But it wasn't out of some elaborate Jewish upbringing. It was simply some kind of deep instinct from a tradition that came down through my father, where my grandfather and my great-grandfather were deeply pious Jews. My great-grandfather, we know, was a mystic, and I think my grandfather was a mystic. And so I went into Syria with the Israeli assault troops, and then I was in the first car of correspondence to traverse the Sinai Desert, which looked like a film from uh, a some kind of Italian movie of just, bodies like flowers, sort of, and all these military vehicles burnt out and so on. But the point is that in 1967, I was quite willing, if necessary, to die for the survival of Israel. And then, fast forward, in 2006, I had a dream which led me to return to Israel, a powerful dream. Being a mystic, I follow my dreams and my visions. And in Jerusalem, I met Rabbi Levi Wyman Kelman. And I had never studied Torah before, but he gave me a copy of Torah. I have it in my lap here. It says, for Michael, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 9 to 13. May you read and write your own Torah with blessings and love from Levi and Paula Wyman Kelman, Jerusalem, May 2006. So he gave me this, and I began to read Torah. And I read it for quite a few years. I have a notation here, began again January 21st, 2015. So from 2006, for quite a long time, I read through the Torah, following the Torah portions for many years. And my wife, Cheryl, for many years, would light the candles. And so I had that deep experience. And so the way I made sense of my identity over time was to describe myself as I do to this day, that I am a Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, yogic Sufi with Taoist influences. And I also describe myself as a radically imperfect human being with a few useful skills. And I don't put myself down either for my polyamory about the forms in which the divine comes to me, nor for being radically imperfect. In fact, I have to confess in this Jewish community that the spirit of what I call the cosmic Christ, or the Christ energy, is central to that diverse identity. But there's this very profound Jewish mystical piece to that. And so Rabbi Levi Wyman Kelman was the first rabbi that spoke to me. And then the second was Rabbi Jonathan Omerman. And Erwin, did you know?
No, I've read about him and I've read his work, but we never met.
Yeah, well, he's an extraordinary man. And I did a series of New School conversations with him. And he was studying Arabic with a Islamic sheikh in order to read the Quran in the original. And he and I bonded over Ibn Arabi, and we did a number of conversations for the New School about it. But he still wasn't my rabbi. So Erwin has been my first rabbi, and I mean that seriously. I come to this evening with an open heart, asking to receive Torah in the spirit of this great holy day. And to allow Torah to come into me in the way that Erwin described the day offers us. So in preparation for this, some days ago, I have quite an extensive, like I have, I don't know what, 10 volumes of Torah and so on and so forth. But I love Abraham Joshua Heschel's work. And one of his books, Heavenly Torah, as refracted through the generations, speaks to me deeply. And chapter 20, lo and behold, is Torah from heaven. And so he works with the question which Erwin was speaking to about the distinction that some of the rabbis made between Torah at Sinai and Torah from heaven, and the debate over whether what was given at Sinai was simply the Ten Commandments or the whole Torah. And he says the word heaven in rabbinic usage has three meanings. It refers to God as in the name of heaven, and it refers to heaven itself, the place. It also refers to the will of God. And so he describes the minimalist and maximalist traditions of what was given at Sinai, and says that the understanding that Torah came from heaven, as I understand it, was a later broadening of the concept. And this broadening of the concept especially took place in Rabbi Akiva's school. We have seen that originally Torah from heaven referred only to the Sinai event. In the extended sense, however, it came to mean that all the narratives in Mitzvah and the entire 5 books were communicated to Moses at Sinai. So from what Erwin said, my understanding is that what he described, and Erwin, perhaps you could tell me if I have this right, is that moment where perhaps only the first syllable uh, uh, knocked everybody out, and one angel administered the shock and the other was there to catch them. So you're using the maximalist view, is that correct?
I I always use the maximalist view.
Right.
I think that these stories invite our imagination, and I think that the ways that we imagine it are in themselves a kind of revelation. The invitation to imagine is an invitation to a revelation.
Right. So what I did, as I often do, there's a AI system called Claude, which it's considered by the tech crowd the most interesting and useful of the AI systems. And I talk with Claude a lot. And so I asked Claude, I said, today is Shavuot, the day on which the Jews received Torah. I'm speaking to the Ner Shalom congregation on the relationship of Shavuot to the writings and teachings of Jeffrey J. Kripal at Rice University, whose work I've been studying in depth. Kripal holds that consciousness itself is the new sacred and that moral codes come later. Now consider that, because the Ten Commandments is clearly a moral code. Since Shavuot celebrates the day on which the Ten Commandments were given, my question is, where does Judaism teach that consciousness itself is ubiquitous and sacred? And Claude responded, what a fascinating intersection you're exploring between Kripal's consciousness studies and Jewish thought for your Shavuot talk. Judaism has rich traditions that resonate with the idea of consciousness as ubiquitous and sacred, though they're often embedded in theological and mystical frameworks rather than stated explicitly, as Kripal does. Several key areas of Jewish teaching point to consciousness as fundamental and sacred. And the first Claude gives is neshama and divine breath. The concept of neshama, divine soul, suggests that human consciousness participates directly in divine consciousness. Then Kabbalistic teachings, the Zohar and other mystical teachings, describe the Shekinah as pervading all reality. The Baal Shem Tov taught that God's presence fills all worlds and that recognition of this omnipresent consciousness is itself a spiritual practice. Then the third is the Talmudic consciousness concept. The Talmud speaks of different levels of soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. And then Hasidic philosophy, particularly in Chabad thought, there's a teaching that there is nothing besides God. For your talk, you might explore how Shavuot represents not just the giving of moral law, but the moment when human consciousness becomes explicitly aware of its divine nature and cosmic responsibility. The revelation at Sinai could be understood as consciousness recognizing itself as sacred, with the commandments flowing from that recognition rather than preceding it. And then I asked, does this possibility relate to the four levels at which Torah can be understood? And Claude says, absolutely. The four levels of Torah interpretation offer a perfect framework for this understanding of how consciousness and sacred awareness operate at different levels, which beautifully connects to both Kripal's work and your Shavuot theme. And then they describe the four levels: Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, the secret or mystical. This maps beautifully onto Kripal's insight that consciousness is primary and sacred. So then I said, what is a passage from Torah that illustrates this best? And Claude said, the passage that most powerfully illustrates this from the actual Shavuot narrative is Exodus 19:16 to 20, but particularly verse 19. Moses would speak, and God would answer him with a voice. This single verse encapsulates the consciousness-Torah relationship across all four levels. Peshat, Moses speaks, God responds, a dialogue between human and divine. Remez, forgive my pronunciation because I don't know these words. The Hebrew Bechal, with a voice, hints that this is an ordinary speech, but a voice that emerges from interaction with consciousness meeting consciousness. Drash teaches that this voice went out and returned to each person according to their capacity to receive it. This suggests that Torah divine instruction emerges from consciousness's encounter with the sacred, tailored to each level of awareness. And Sod, the Zohar explains that Moses and God's voices became one voice. There's no separation between divine consciousness expressing and human consciousness receiving. The answer isn't information transferred, but consciousness recognizing itself. What makes this perfect for your Kripal connection is that the verse suggests responsiveness rather than command. God doesn't just speak to Moses, God responds through the very act of Moses speaking. This implies that sacred awareness emerges from consciousness engaging with itself, exactly what Kripal means when he says consciousness is the new sacred. The moral code of the Ten Commandments flow from this moment of consciousness recognizing its sacred nature in dialogue with itself. Torah becomes not external law imposed on consciousness, but consciousness discovering its own sacred structure. Finally, I said, did Baal Shem Tov in fact die on this day? And Claude said, yes, the Baal Shem Tov died on the first day of Shavuot in 1760. This adds an extraordinary layer of meaning to your talk. The fact that the founder of Hasidism, a movement that revolutionized Judaism by emphasizing consciousness, divine presence in everyday life, and direct connection with the sacred, died on the first day that celebrates the giving of Torah, creates a profound theological symmetry. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and ask Erwin, my rabbi, to comment and to offer me some guidance as very much a beginner in these matters. Where am I on the right track? Where could my direction use some correction?
Mhm. Well, thank you, Michael, for all of that. And thank you, Claude. and it's really creepy. And I'm glad you asked those questions to Claude, because you got a whole bunch of interesting stuff. I think Judaism does have a longstanding instinct about consciousness, and the examples you gave are the right examples. In our Kabbalistic view of the world, in the four worlds, you have the world of Atzilut, where we're in such close proximity to the divine that we can't even talk about it. We don't have enough distance to talk about it. Or if you see the map of the tree of life, before Keter, before the top sphira, is Ein Sof, is the infinite. And the infinite is what's behind all of this machinery. And it might be that, the music goes round and round and pops out a world at the bottom, but all of this is really just some kind of manifestation coming out of a primordial, infinite consciousness that's on one side it's infinity, it's the everything, and on the other side it's no thing, it's the ayin, it's the no thing. We also, even in our exoteric, in our non mystical mythology, right? What are the things that exist before God says, "Let there be light"? Ruach Elohim merachevet al pnei atehom, that, or al pnei hamayim, al pnei atehom. Okay, that the breath of God is fluttering on the deep, and that there's darkness, and there's this flutter of breath over the deep, and there's something about that image, this idea that sort of the world of divisions, light and dark, sea and land and heaven, that those come out of something that is primordial but exists. In other words, God doesn't create light, land, sky, sea out of nothing, but rather there is some kind of field there already the Torah describes as dark and deep, with a flutter of spirit. So yeah, I think the examples that Claude gave you are right on. And we've got, I think, 10 more minutes or something like that. I want people to be able to ask questions. But I'm curious if you could bring us back. So it was gorgeous. Thank you. And I'm wondering if you could bring us back to just training us up a little bit on panpsychism. Like, when you say the material world is some kind of reflex of consciousness, that wasn't the wording you used, but how is it that what within say Jeffrey Kripal's particular variant of panpsychism, how is it that the world as we know it emerges? And I will just say that, again, if you think of the tree of life, at the beginning you have the infinite, and at the end of the machinery you have the world of separation, the world that we understand and see and observe and think we live in exclusively. So like that is reflected in a Jewish model that in this community people are very conversant in. But going back to a non-Jewish sort of Kripal understanding, could you give us a little bit more about this idea of panpsychism?
Yes. First of all, Wikipedia has a brilliant description of panpsychism as a meta theory that has 10 different variants or more, some of which are Neoplatonic consciousness as primary, others, as Oren and I have been studying, because there's a group of us studying Kripal's work together, that this thing called dual aspect monism, meaning it's actually all one, but as I said, our cognitive structure divides the material and the consciousness. And therefore, I would say the work of spirit is to reunite them. And when Oren describes this extraordinary book, The Flip, which is clearly the most accessible of his 13 books, when people have the flip into cosmic consciousness, they see the union of the material. And I also want to apologize if I carried on too long here.
No,
And
not at,
okay.
not
And
at all.
Oren, do you want to add anything? Because I'd love to hear any further reflections you have.
Well, I mean, part of it is the idea that we can hold both at the same time is a challenge. It's been, in this 21st century, the tendency towards materialism is kind of blinding in terms of the capacity to look at those things that are inexplicable that you can't prove, but are manifestations of consciousness. So there's a certain loss there. And I'm wondering, like, are we saying that God is a form of consciousness, right? And is the attempt to try and personify God as a man or as a human, is that an attempt to try and squeeze consciousness into a materialist form so that it's accessible? And what gets lost in that process? What gets lost when we try to take the Ein Sof and put it in an image? I mean, I think for some people it might be real, but for other people it's a metaphor. But this kind of constraining, what gets lost is the view of all these phenomena um, that are unavailable to the materialistic mind. And I think that's kind of what happens in the flip, that you have to hold both at the same time. It's right, it's kind of like, energy could be a particle, it can be a wave, and they have to be the same thing. And when you start thinking about it, your mind kind of explodes. How can they be both things at the same time? It's the same kind of thing, that consciousness is the other side of the coin, and that's what Kripal focuses on in the flip. And what is the meaning for us if we step out of the materialist world? We're starting to trust different ways of knowing. It's a whole different epistemology, a different way of holding knowledge that is not something that is easily accessible. Even in religions, I'm not sure it's accessible. People talk about in psychedelic trips that there's a sudden knowing, as if there's an epistemological shift when you're tripping. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but there is a crack in materialism that happens that allows you to see new horizons. And it's interesting that for some people, it's about seeing God. It's about seeing the divine, which is about seeing consciousness is cracking open that kind of dogmatic religion, which is, one of the things I love about Ner Shalom, that it's not dogmatic in terms of religion, but many of us in our source communities, trust me, Israel has plenty of it, has a certain dogmatic that you can't crack it open, but once you do, you can actually see the beauty of that divine.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just now replaying the story of Sinai, the way you started, Michael. Like now seeing the the knowing. What is this flash of knowing? Why is it that the rabbis describe a flash at midnight? Why is that the metaphor they choose? Or why is it that the mystics say that that the people saw the sounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it wasn't, as a way of saying this was not typical physical perception. Like, not that literally they're seeing sounds, but rather they were perceiving in a way that was beyond what they were physically used to. And what is it? And what is this beautiful idea about what they heard was just the Aleph?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that the Aleph is a totality, and also is beyond words? Right? There's no sound in it. There's no sound that can, sound is a separating
Mm-hmm.
force. And how is it that opening up and the whole community together hearing the Aleph is about that, having access to that primordial consciousness?
Well, I know we have to close, but I will say briefly that what on one level, I've been studying this for 50 years, but a few years ago, I ran across two books by a physician named Tucker on children who remember past lives from the University of Virginia. He continued the work of Ian Stevenson. And I looked at this and I became very convinced that the data that some children remember past lives was completely impeccable. And given that that was true, that made me begin to think about all of the other so-called paranormal phenomena of intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, remote viewing, near-death experiences, near-death awareness, visitations from our dead, the power of prayer, and all these other experiences for which materialism has no explanation. And so the thing about Kripal's dual aspect monism is that it says, yes, materialism is very real, but it's incomplete and it cannot explain these paranormal phenomena. Whereas panpsychism, whatever you want to call it, the idea that consciousness is either primary or ubiquitous, um, allows us to explain the anomalous phenomena. And so I find that very persuasive. And there is this strong resurgence of interest in a view of consciousness as ubiquitous in physics, in neurosciences, in philosophy of mind, and in a whole set of other fields. So that's what is persuasive to me, and that's why the title of this little session, does spirit move among us? Uh, Suggests that yes, it actually does, and that in order to understand that, we need to understand Torah in the sense, Erwin, that you teach it, and as your follower, I am studying it with you.
Thank you, Michael. It's very intimidating. Um, uh, you following me is very intimidating. Um, and I'm so grateful to the two of you for having this conversation tonight. I get to I get to hear the two of you talk a lot, and I get to hear the two of you talk at Commonweal, and I get to hear you talk over dinner. And I'm so glad that my community at Ner Shalom now gets to share in that abundance of revelation. I'm curious if people's heads are spinning, if your eyes are dilated, if you're having a psychedelic experience. We're we will have
That's where Michael went.
oh yeah, Eileen's comment is where Michael went. Um, I I don't think we have time for questions on this session. We will in the subsequent sessions, but maybe people could grace us with putting a word or two into the chat of where you're at in this moment, or if anything has awakened for you, including resistance, including BS, or whatever is moving for you. Just throw it in the chat so that we can share this together. Yes, it is The Flip by Jeffrey Kripal, spelled that way.
And the website jeffreyjkripal.com is extraordinarily rich and deep on his thought.
Uh-huh.
And I do want to greet Annabelle Kaufman and Susan Richter and other friends who are here. Annabelle is, again, another teacher for me through her extraordinary poems, which I am privileged to receive.
A few of these reactions, there are some question marks. There's, I love consciousness knowing and informing itself. Um, uh, Hang on. Who needs drugs when we have you three guys to take us on a trip? Thank you, Rita. Now I want to read The Flip, says Amy. Dorothy, Dr. Fluffy says it makes me think of motherhood. Develops in a woman's body. The unimaginable begins, forced into the now with the needs and responses of the carer, the great carer. AI. Oh, sorry. AI Avraham. Tonight was fantastic. Thank you, Sarah Grace. There's hours still ahead. Howard found this very abstract. Howard, you should look at the book. It takes you through in a very methodical way that's kind of mind bending. Lay, I read it last year when I was on sabbatical, and it changed my dreams. I don't know if other people have experienced this with the book, but all my dreams were changing. Wonderful to hear this, says Leah. Of course, I agree completely and celebrate this conversation. Of course, Leah does. We know that. Stephanie Brown says, hearing, in quote, a voice in one's head sent telepathically during dreams feels to be related to this topic. Andrew and Monday, Andrew says, I'm glad we aren't on mushrooms right now. Joan says, I'm all in. Looking forward to reading the flip. Dorothy, maybe we need to have a book reading group on the flip. Dorothy says, Israelites said, we will do and we will hear. Na'aseh v'nishma. Zelda is very moved, feels like the most important Shavuot for me yet. Cynthia Babbitt says, wow. And Basha says, I love consciousness knowing and informing itself. And Ruach Dvorah says, and thinking of it as sacred. Terry says, Michael, will you come back and teach us here at Ner Shalom? Oh, good. Pretty difficult for me to follow, Michael, a bit beyond what I'm used to. Atzilah says, beautiful and moving, thank you. Robin says, love senses itself in the deepest center. Tikkun olam, light gathers. I don't think I can get through all of these, but I encourage everybody to take a look at these, maybe after Atzilah, but before the second session begins, and feel part of an organism, a community that is an organism, breathing in this knowing and responding to it with all the ways that we breathe in and respond to stimuli. So Michael, Oren, thank you both so much. Chag Sameach, good Yantif. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you, Erwin. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm really grateful for the criticisms. That's how I grow. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Chag Sameach.
Right.
So we'll turn it over to Atzilah. Atzilah, good to see you. I don't see you yet. Good to see you in a moment.
I'm going to be introducing Atzilah.
Great.
This is Barbara Lesh McCaffrey. I'm the dean of our lifelong Jewish learning, and it's my great pleasure to provide an opportunity for our minds to float for a little bit, and maybe see the connections in a way that our logical brains are not quite equipped for. I'd love to be able to say just a tiny bit about Atzilah. She's a chant leader, composer, performance artist, visual artist, and teacher in body, mind, movement arts. She's dedicated to gently and playfully guiding others into their bodies to cultivate deep presence, creativity, satisfaction, and joy. And I can attest to that. I've had the great pleasure of being in her presence and chanting with her. She's a student of Rabbi Shefa Gold and a graduate of the Kol Zimra Chant Leadership Group, and she served for over a dozen years as our resident chant leader at Ner Shalom. Atzilah.
Chag Sameach, everybody. I just want to briefly share something that happened this week, a couple of days ago. I got a call from Joanne Witt, one of the congregants of Ner Shalom, and I hadn't heard from her for years. And it was so, I actually had thought of her, and I know her mother died recently, and I'm living with my mother who's turned 95. And I'm in the Sonoran Desert here, by the way, and it's rained during this whole thing, which is unusual and kind of a miracle, actually. And anyway, it was Joanne noted that how wonderful it is to actually speak with someone who has known one for like the continuity of a connection, honoring the fact that we really journeyed together for a certain period very deeply. And then that when we speak, it's just satisfying and such a different, it was notable for me since I'm away from you all and many other people. So I just wanted to tell that story just a little bit. And then during she introduced me to a a regular meeting that happens that she's going to honor her mother and like that. And she invited me to come because I mentioned that I was lots of grief and like that, like the times we're living in and all things. So, but she kept saying, but they're all connected, Aleph, but they're all connected, but we're all connected. And it was a very, very sweet and satisfying experience to have that. And so that I just use that as a way of bringing me back. Okay, so I'm a little more back than I was. So thank you for indulging me. We're going to do a chant called Unveil My Eyes, Gal Enai. And before we do it, please sense into whatever you're sitting on. Just kind of do a little wiggle and sense into that place. Because moving is one of the ways that some of us come a little bit more present. I told my mother the other day, you have to move more to get more. You have to move more to get more energy. So there you go, just saying. Anyway, so the words to this chant are Gal Enai Ve'abita. Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot Mitoratecha. Unveil my eyes that I might see the miracles of your Torah.
How can I? Oops, sorry.
Excuse me. So we're going to do this a little bit as a nigun, just so you can get a little used to the melody, and then we'll do it with the words. And the intention is really to honor the process, the growth and exploration that we've been through during this Omer period, and both individually and collectively. And just being open to noting that we have this conditioning and limitations, and just allow some of that, just invite and pray for those to soften and drop away and affirm our vulnerability, calling in a new vision for our lives, opening to new learning and possibilities.
And Raja has added the words into the chat.
Okay. Thank you, Raja. Ya la 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 la. Ya la la ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la la ya la la la. Ya la la ya la 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 la. Ya la la ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 la. Gal Enai Ve'abita, Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot, Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot Mitoratecha. Gal Enai Ve'abita, Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot, Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot Mitoratecha. Gal Enai Ve'abita, Gal Enai Ve'abita Niflaot. נפלאות, גלני והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. גלני, 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 או גלני. גלני והביטה, גלני והביטה נפלאות, גלני והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. גלני והביטה, גלני והביטה נפלאות, גלני והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. גלני, 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 או גלני. גלני והביטה, גלני והביטה נפלאות, גלני והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. גלני והביטה, גלני והביטה נפלאות, גלני והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. גלני, 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 או גלני. יאי ללי, ללללי, יאי ללי, יללללללי, יאי ללי, יללללי, לללללי. Gallina, 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 oh Gallina, Gallina, Gallina. Just take a moment to be in stillness for a moment.